A massive stone dragon statue overlooks the Golden Gate Strait. Behind it, a city that is San Francisco, but isn't. Pagoda-style skyscrapers pierce the fog, their red and gold lacquer gleaming in the morning sun. There is a version of history where the Pacific Ocean belonged to China, where the Great Wall didn't end at the sea, but extended across it, not in stone, but in trade routes, colonies, and cultural dominance that stretched from Beijing to what you know as California. In that world, when European explorers finally reached the Americas in the late 1500s, they didn't find indigenous empires. They found something that stopped them cold. Chinese fortresses dotting the coastline, trade ports bustling with ships bearing the dragon banner, and millions of people, a fusion of Asian and indigenous cultures who had been connected to the Middle Kingdom for over 150 years. This is the story of what didn't happen but could have. The story of Admiral Zheng He's 8th voyage, the one that never turned back. The story of how 70 decades of Chinese exploration and colonization created a world unrecognizable to our own. A world where the center of gravity never shifted to Europe, where the age of exploration ended before it began, where the 21st century speaks Mandarin not as the language of a rising power, but as the language that has dominated global commerce for 600 years. The Ming Dynasty had the ships. They had the navigation. They had the will to explore. They had everything they needed except one thing: the decision to continue. In our world, they stopped. In this world, they didn't. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what truly existed. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming Dynasty launched 7 massive naval expeditions under Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who commanded the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. These weren't small exploratory missions. Zheng He's treasure fleets consisted of over 300 ships and 27,000 men. His flagship, a 9-masted Leviathan, was over 400 feet long, making Columbus's Santa Maria look like a rowboat. The treasure voyages reached Java, Sumatra, India, Persia, Arabia, and the eastern coast of Africa. They brought back tribute, established trade relations, and projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean. They proved that China possessed the technology and organizational capability to circumnavigate the globe. But in 1433, something changed. The Xuande emperor died. The treasure voyages were deemed too expensive. Confucian scholars at court, who had always opposed the expeditions as wasteful and contrary to China's inward-focused philosophy, gained power. The great ships were mothballed. Many were burned. The records of the voyages were destroyed. China turned inward. Within a generation, it became illegal to build ocean-going vessels. The greatest navy in human history simply ceased to exist. When European ships arrived in Asian waters a century later, they found a China that had deliberately forgotten how to sail. This decision to abandon the sea changed everything. In our timeline, Europe filled the void. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English ships claimed the oceans. They discovered the Americas, circumnavigated the globe, and established the colonial empires that would shape the modern world. But here's what historians often overlook. Zheng He's fleet had the capability to reach the Americas. Chinese ships had been sailing to Africa, a journey of similar distance, for decades. They had the navigation technology, the magnetic compass, detailed star charts, sophisticated rudder systems. They had ships larger and more seaworthy than anything Europe would build for another century.
They were closer to the Americas across the Pacific than Europe was across the Atlantic. The treasure voyages reached their furthest point in 1433, the same year they were canceled. Zheng He himself died during that final voyage, perhaps near the coast of India, perhaps somewhere else. The records are incomplete, deliberately so. In our world, that final voyage turned back to China, and history took the path we know. But what if it hadn't? What if the Xuande emperor had lived another decade? What if the court politics had shifted differently? What if Zheng He had received orders not to return, but to continue east, to discover what lay beyond the Pacific horizon?
In this timeline, the Xuande emperor didn't die in 1435. He lived until 1445. And in the spring of 1433, as Zheng He prepared what would have been his final voyage, the emperor made a different decision. Reports had reached the court of lands far to the east, rumors from Japanese traders about islands beyond islands, and perhaps a great landmass across the Eastern Ocean. The emperor was intrigued. More importantly, he was worried. The Confucian scholars had been arguing for years that the treasure voyages were wasteful, but the emperor saw something they didn't: geopolitical reality. The Mongol Yuan dynasty, which had ruled China before the Ming, had been empire builders. They had conquered lands, extracted tribute, and created the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Ming had driven them out, but the emperor understood that China's security depended on being stronger than any potential rival. And strength in the 15th century came from controlling trade routes. If there were lands beyond the Eastern Ocean, China needed to claim them first. Not for conquest. The Chinese concept of empire was different from the European model, but for tributary relationships, for recognition of Chinese superiority, for the expansion of Tianxia, all under heaven. The orders were unprecedented. Sail east, cross the Great Ocean, discover what lies beyond, establish contact with any civilizations encountered, plant the dragon banner, create tributary relationships, and do not return for 5 years. Zheng He was given 3 years of provisions, authority to establish colonies, and 60 of the finest ships in the treasure fleet. In July 1433, the 8th treasure voyage departed from Nanjing. It would never return. The crossing took 9 months, longer than planned. They encountered storms, doldrums, and near mutiny. But Zheng He was not just an admiral, he was a survivor, a man who had commanded expeditions to the edges of the known world. In April 1434, the Chinese fleet made landfall on the western coast of what we call Mexico, near modern-day Acapulco. First contact. The Chinese ships were met by local peoples, coastal communities with their own complex societies, trade networks, and spiritual beliefs. These weren't the mighty Aztec or Incan empires, but they were sophisticated civilizations nonetheless. What happened next would determine everything. In our timeline, when Europeans arrived in the Americas 60 years later, they brought disease, guns, and a philosophy of conquest. They saw resources to extract and souls to convert. The Chinese brought something different. The tributary system wasn't colonization in the European sense. It was a trade relationship built on hierarchical respect. Local rulers would acknowledge Chinese superiority, pay nominal tribute, and receive protection, trade access, and gifts of far greater value in return. It was empire by prestige, not by direct rule. Zheng He wasn't authorized to conquer. He was authorized to negotiate. And negotiate he did. Over the following year, Chinese expeditions explored the coastline, established 3 permanent settlements, and made contact with indigenous empires inland. Gifts were exchanged, technology was shared, metalworking techniques, agricultural tools, navigational knowledge. And then the ships returned to China. Not all of them. 15 ships, carrying news of the discovery, samples of unknown crops, and indigenous emissaries who had volunteered to travel to the Middle Kingdom. When word reached Beijing in 1436, the emperor made the decision that would reshape world history. The treasure voyages would continue. Not 7 voyages,
but an ongoing program, a permanent Pacific fleet, the establishment of New China across the Eastern Ocean. The age of Chinese colonization had begun.
The first decade, 1434 to 1444, establishment. The initial Chinese settlements were small, a few thousand colonists total, but they were strategic. The Ming Dynasty approached colonization methodically. They established 3 primary settlements along the Pacific coast, chosen for natural harbors and proximity to indigenous trade networks. These weren't military conquests, but trading posts, modeled on the same system China had used throughout Southeast Asia for centuries. The colonists were primarily traders, craftsmen, and farmers, not soldiers. The goal wasn't occupation, but integration. Chinese merchants married into local families. Technology flowed in both directions. Chinese metallurgy and shipbuilding met indigenous knowledge of local agriculture, geography, and medicine. But the Chinese also brought something invisible and devastating: disease. Unlike the catastrophic European epidemics that would kill up to 90% of indigenous Americans, the Chinese introduction of Eurasian diseases was slower and less deadly for one critical reason: incremental exposure. Chinese traders had been in contact with Southeast Asian and Indian populations for centuries. The disease vectors they carried had already spread through those populations gradually. When they reached the Americas, the initial waves were severe, but not civilizationally destructive. Mortality rates among indigenous peoples in contact zones reached perhaps 30 to 40% over the first decade, devastating but survivable. Communities adapted, recovered, and developed resistance. This single difference would change everything. The indigenous empires, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, wouldn't collapse from disease alone. They would encounter Chinese civilization from a position of relative strength, not terminal decline.
The Great Encounter, 1445 to 1660, 2 empires meet. When Chinese diplomats reached Tenochtitlan in 1445, they encountered something they didn't expect: another sophisticated empire. The Aztec capital housed 200,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, rivaling Beijing itself. Its causeways, aqueducts, and floating gardens impressed even the Chinese engineers. This wasn't a primitive society. This was a rival civilization. The tributary system that worked with smaller kingdoms struggled here. The Aztecs weren't interested in acknowledging Chinese superiority. They had their own concept of empire, their own tributary relationships with surrounding peoples. Initial negotiations were tense, formal, and ultimately inconclusive. But trade began anyway. Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, steel tools, and especially steel weapons were valuable to the Aztecs. In return, China received cacao, cotton, obsidian, and gold. Lots of gold. Over the next 15 years, an uneasy relationship developed. Not tributary submission, not alliance, but pragmatic exchange. The Chinese taught metallurgy. The Aztecs learned to forge steel weapons and tools, fundamentally altering their military capability. In return, Chinese settlers learned indigenous agricultural techniques, chinampas, the sophisticated floating garden system that could feed cities.
The Cascade Effect, 1460 to 1500, a different balance. By 1460, the Pacific coast of the Americas had transformed. 6 major Chinese settlements housing over 50,000 colonists, dozens of indigenous communities integrated into the Chinese tributary system, and inland, indigenous empires strengthened by Chinese technology but not destroyed by Chinese conquest. The steel-armed Aztecs expanded their empire more rapidly. The Inca, making contact with Chinese traders who had explored south along the coast, similarly adopted metal weapons and tools. These empires didn't collapse, they industrialized, at least partially. This created a balance of power unlike anything in our timeline. Chinese settlements controlled the coasts and maritime trade. Indigenous empires controlled the interior and resources. Neither could dominate the other completely, so they coexisted, competed, and occasionally fought limited wars over trade access and territory. It was messy, it was violent at times, but it was fundamentally different from European colonization.
The indigenous peoples weren't eradicated. Their cultures weren't destroyed. They were transformed, yes, but they remained powerful political entities. The Cascade Effect, 1460 to 1500, a different balance. By 1460, the Pacific coast of the Americas had transformed. 6 major Chinese settlements housing over 50,000 colonists. Dozens of indigenous communities integrated into the Chinese tributary system, and inland, indigenous empires strengthened by Chinese technology but not destroyed by Chinese conquest. The steel-armed Aztecs expanded their empire more rapidly. The Inca, making contact with Chinese traders who had explored south along the coast, similarly adopted metal weapons and tools. These empires didn't collapse. They industrialized, at least partially. This created a balance of power unlike anything in our timeline. Chinese settlements controlled the coasts and maritime trade. Indigenous empires controlled the interior and resources. Neither could dominate the other completely, so they coexisted, competed, and occasionally fought limited wars over trade access and territory. It was messy, it was violent at times, but it was fundamentally different from European colonization. The indigenous peoples weren't eradicated. Their cultures weren't destroyed. They were transformed, yes, but they remained powerful political entities.
The Modern World, 1550 to 2025, a multipolar reality. The world that emerged from this colonial period looked radically different from ours. China never turned inward. Maintaining the American colonies required a permanent naval presence, which prevented the isolationist turn that happened in our timeline. The Ming dynasty, enriched by American gold and silver, never fell to the Qing dynasty. China entered the Industrial Revolution as a maritime power, not a land empire. The indigenous empires survived, modernized, and became major powers. The Aztec Empire, which in our world was destroyed in 1521, persisted into the modern era, evolving into a constitutional monarchy by the 1800s. Similarly, the Inca realm transformed into an industrial state. By 2025, the world has 3 major civilizational spheres. The Pacific Sphere, dominated by China, including the Western Americas, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. Over 3 billion people. Mandarin is the global trade language. The Atlantic Sphere, European-influenced Americas and Europe. Democracy emerged here first, as it did in our world. The indigenous empires, the Aztec Federation, Mexico and Central America, and the Inca Union, Andean South America, modernized indigenous powers that play balancing roles between East and West.
Consequence. The world of 2025 in this timeline is wealthier, more culturally diverse, and more politically complex than ours. Without the near-complete destruction of indigenous peoples, the Americas never became blank slates for European civilization. Instead, they became spaces of negotiation, fusion, and conflict. 3 major cultural traditions, Chinese, European, and indigenous, collided and merged over 6 centuries. The results are visible everywhere. Cuisine, language, architecture, philosophy, everything bears the marks of multiple traditions. But this world has its own tragedies. The wars of colonization still killed millions. Disease, while slower than in our timeline, still devastated indigenous populations. The struggle for resources, trade dominance, and territory still caused immense suffering. And in this world, certain atrocities simply took different forms. Chinese colonization wasn't benevolent. It was simply different. The tributary system created hierarchies that persisted into the modern era. Discrimination, exploitation, and cultural suppression existed, just targeted differently, justified differently. This isn't a utopia. It's an alternate complexity. The fundamental questions remain the same. How do cultures coexist? Who controls resources? What does justice look like? But the players are different. The balance of power is different. In our world, the 21st century is defined by Western decline and Chinese rise. In this world, China never fell. The West was never globally dominant, and indigenous civilizations never disappeared. Technology in this timeline progressed differently. The Industrial Revolution began simultaneously in China and Europe, creating competing standards, parallel innovations, and ultimately faster technological development. Space exploration, computing, biotechnology all emerged from multipolar competition rather than Western dominance. But human nature remained the same. Wars still happened, inequality still existed, environmental destruction accelerated just as fast, faster perhaps, with multiple industrial powers competing rather than one hegemonic system.
Reflection. There's a question that haunts historians. Are the great patterns of history inevitable? Would industrialization have happened regardless of who led it? Would globalization have occurred no matter which culture connected the world? Would modernity, with all its benefits and horrors, have emerged from any colonial system? The Dragon Shore timeline suggests an uncomfortable answer: yes and no. The technological trajectory remains similar. Steam power, electricity, computers, space travel, these emerged on roughly the same timeline. The laws of physics don't care who discovers them, but the cultural landscape is unrecognizable. In our world, modernity speaks primarily through Western idioms: democracy, capitalism, individualism. These became universal values, not because they truly are universal, but because the West had the power to make them so. In this world, modernity speaks in multiple dialects. Chinese concepts of harmony and hierarchy, indigenous traditions of communal land rights, European democratic ideals, all coexisting, competing, influencing each other. Would this world be better than ours? That's the wrong question. It would be different. Different winners, different losers, different atrocities, and different achievements. The Chinese colonization of the Americas wasn't prevented by morality, it was prevented by a single emperor's decision to stop sailing. One choice, one moment, and the entire trajectory of human civilization pivoted. The truth is simpler and more terrifying than we'd like to admit. History is fragile. The world we know, with all its structures, assumptions, and power relationships, emerged from countless small decisions that could have gone differently. Zheng He's fleet turned back in 1433. In doing so, it left the oceans to Europe and condemned Asia to centuries of colonization, exploitation, and struggle to reclaim its place in the world. But in another timeline, in the one we've glimpsed here, the fleet kept sailing, and everything changed. Perhaps the lesson isn't about who should have colonized the Americas. Perhaps it's that colonization itself, regardless of who does it, regardless of the methods, always creates worlds of profound complexity, mixing triumph with tragedy, progress with exploitation. The Dragon Shore isn't a better world. It's just a different one. History belongs not to those who deserved it, but to those who sailed for it. And in every world, someone always does.